The laughter around our dinner table had a cruel edge to it, the kind that comes when successful people mock those they perceive as failures. I sat quietly at the end of our mahogany table, watching my husband Marcus regale his colleagues with yet another story about my adorable little business attempts. "She actually thought she could revolutionize digital marketing," Marcus said, swirling his wine glass with practiced sophistication. "Spent months working on some presentation about micro-influencer networks. I had to gently explain why it would never work in the real world." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The partners from Sterling and Associates nodded sympathetically, their expressions a mixture of amusement and pity. Richard Sterling himself leaned forward, his silver hair catching the light from our crystal chandelier. "It's sweet that she tries," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But some people just aren't cut out for the business world. Takes a certain ruthlessness." I forced a small, embarrassed smile, playing my role perfectly. The same role I'd been playing for 3 years, ever since I married Marcus and decided to conduct the most elaborate social experiment of my life. What I hadn't told anyone, not Marcus, not his colleagues, not even my closest friends, was that I was already living in the business world. In fact, I owned a significant piece of it. "More wine, darling?" Marcus asked, not waiting for my answer before filling my glass. "We're celebrating Richard's latest acquisition, Stellar Digital Solutions. Apparently they had some revolutionary approach to micro-influencer marketing." My heart stopped. Stellar Digital was my company. Well, one of them, hidden behind layers of shell corporations and managed through intermediaries, but undeniably mine. The revolutionary approach they'd acquired was the exact presentation I'd shown Marcus 6 months ago, the one he'd dismissed as cute but impractical. "Fascinating," I managed, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "What made their approach so special?" Richard pulled out his phone, scrolling to a presentation slide. "See, they understood something most agencies miss. That authentic engagement comes from genuine community connections, not follower counts. They developed this whole framework for identifying micro-influencers who align with brand values rather than just demographics." Word for word. It was my presentation, down to the specific terminology I'd coined. I watched Marcus nod along knowledgeably, adding his own commentary about market positioning and consumer psychology, theories I'd developed and shared with him during late-night conversations about business strategy. "Marcus actually had some insights that helped us understand the potential," Richard continued. "His understanding of consumer behavior is remarkable." "I've always been interested in the psychology behind purchasing decisions," Marcus said modestly, though his chest puffed with pride. "It's all about understanding what drives people at a fundamental level." The irony was exquisite. Marcus was taking credit for research I'd conducted during my doctoral studies in behavioral psychology, back when he thought I was just playing student with my trust fund. He had no idea that Dr. Sarah Chen, the mysterious consultant who'd revolutionized Sterling and Associates' approach to consumer psychology, was sitting right next to him, pretending to be impressed by his borrowed wisdom. "Sarah, you should take notes," Marcus said with a patronizing smile. "This is how real business gets done, not through pie-in-the-sky presentations, but through understanding market realities." I nodded eagerly, pulling out my phone as if to take notes. Instead, I was checking the encrypted messages from my team. The acquisition of Stellar Digital had been completed 3 hours ago for $47 million, money that would ultimately flow back to me through the complex web of holding companies I'd spent years constructing. "The beauty of the Stellar acquisition," Richard continued, "is that it came from nowhere. No one in the industry had heard of them 6 months ago, but their methodology was so sound, so innovative, that we couldn't ignore it. Because I'd designed it to appear that way, Stellar Digital had been my test case, a way to validate my theories about corporate acquisitions while remaining completely invisible. I'd watched from the shadows as Sterling and Associates circled my creation like sharks, exactly as I'd predicted they would." "What happened to the original team?" I asked innocently. "The people who developed these ideas?" "Anonymous consultants." Richard waved dismissively. "Probably some freelancers who got lucky with a good idea. They're well compensated, I'm sure, but they're not built for the long game. That's why companies like ours exist, to take good ideas and make them into something lasting." Marcus raised his glass. "To taking good ideas and making them profitable." The toast echoed around the table. a chorus of successful men celebrating their ability to commodify innovation. I raised my glass too, letting my smile falter just enough to seem wistful. In reality, I was calculating the exact moment when I would reveal that every good idea they'd profited from in the last 2 years had originated from the woman they were systematically underestimating. After dinner, as the partners filtered out to their luxury cars, Marcus found me in the kitchen loading our dishwasher. The domestic scene was carefully crafted. I'd learned that nothing made successful men feel more powerful than watching their wives handle mundane tasks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Great dinner, sweetheart," he said, loosening his tie. "I think Richard was impressed by how well you handled yourself. You didn't try to insert yourself into the business conversation too much." "I know my place," I replied softly, though the words tasted like acid. "I'm still learning so much from listening to you." Marcus smiled, the expression both fond and condescending. "That's what I love about you, Sarah. You're not threatened by success. Some wives get jealous when their husbands are more accomplished, but you're secure enough to be supportive." More accomplished. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus had built his career on a foundation of ideas he'd stolen from me, presentations he'd claimed as his own insights, and strategies he'd learned during pillow talk and then presented as original thinking. His accomplishments were a carefully constructed facade, and he had no idea that the architect of his success was standing 3 feet away, wearing an apron and loading wine glasses. "I just want to understand your world better," I said, drying my hands on a dish towel. "Maybe someday I'll be able to contribute something meaningful." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, though his tone suggested he found this unlikely. "For now, focus on what you're good at. This house, supporting me, being the perfect partner. Not everyone can be a business leader, and that's okay." I nodded, accepting the dismissal with practiced grace. "You're right, I should stick to what I know." What I knew, of course, was far more than Marcus could imagine. While he slept beside me each night, dreaming of his next promotion at Sterling & Associates, I was building an empire, silent partnerships in tech startups, strategic investments in emerging markets, consulting contracts with Fortune 500 companies, all carefully hidden behind corporate structures, so complex that even forensic accountants would struggle to trace them back to me. The next morning, I maintained my routine of domestic perfection. Coffee ready when Marcus woke up, breakfast prepared to his exact specifications, his clothes laid out with military precision. He ate quickly, scrolling through business news on his tablet while I pretended to read a lifestyle magazine. "Interesting," he murmured, pausing on an article. "Sterling & Associates just announced a new strategic partnership with quantum analytics. Never heard of them, but apparently they're revolutionizing data interpretation for consumer behavior." I nearly choked on my orange juice. Quantum analytics was another of my creations, designed specifically to complement the stellar digital acquisition. The partnership Marcus was reading about had been in development for 8 months, carefully orchestrated to create maximum value for Sterling & Associates while positioning my next revelation perfectly. "What do they do?" I asked, leaning over to read the screen. "Says here they've developed proprietary algorithms for predicting consumer trends," Marcus explained. "Real cutting-edge stuff, the kind of innovation that separates the leaders from the followers in our industry." The algorithms he was referring to were based on my doctoral thesis, refined through years of practical application and validated through the consumer psychology consulting I'd been doing under various pseudonyms. Every breakthrough Sterling & Associates had achieved in the last 18 months could be traced back to my work, fed to them through Marcus or through direct consultation under assumed identities. "Sounds complicated," I said with just the right amount of bewilderment. "It is," Marcus agreed, standing to grab his briefcase. "That's why it takes years of experience to understand these kinds of advanced concepts. Don't worry about it, sweetheart. Focus on your charity work and leave the business strategy to the professionals." My charity work, another carefully constructed element of my facade. The Sarah Chen Foundation, which Marcus believed was funded by my trust fund, was actually one of the most successful impact investment vehicles in the nonprofit sector. We'd revolutionized educational technology in underserved communities while generating substantial returns for our silent partners. But to Marcus, it was just his wife's little hobby, a way to keep me busy while the men handled real business. After he left for the office, I retreated to my study, the one room in the house Marcus never entered, dismissing it as my craft space. Behind a false wall that I'd had installed during our renovation, my real office waited. 3 monitors displaying real-time data from 15 different companies, secure communication systems connecting me to partners across 6 continents, and a comprehensive surveillance setup that would make intelligence agencies envious. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message from David Kim, my most trusted advisor and one of the few people who knew the full scope of my operations. The message was brief but significant. Sterling meeting confirmed. Package delivered. Timeline accelerated. I smiled, pulling up the surveillance feeds from Sterling & Associates' executive conference room. The package David referred to was a comprehensive analysis of market opportunities in the Southeast Asian tech sector, delivered anonymously to Richard Sterling's office that morning. The analysis, which had taken my team 6 months to complete, would lead Sterling & Associates to their most profitable expansion in company history. It would also put them in direct partnership with Chen Enterprises, my primary holding company. Marcus had no idea that his wife's family business in Singapore was actually a billion-dollar conglomerate with interests spanning technology, real estate, and strategic consulting. He'd always assumed my wealth came from old money and family connections, never bothering to investigate the complex reality of my financial empire. Through the camera feeds, I watched Marcus enter the conference room, his expression eager and ambitious. He'd been angling for a senior partnership at Sterling & Associates for 2 years, unaware that his promotion was already guaranteed. Not because of his talent or dedication, but because I needed him in that position for the next phase of my plan. Richard Sterling stood at the head of the table, holding the analysis my team had prepared. "Gentlemen, we've received some remarkable intelligence about opportunities in Singapore and Malaysia. The source is anonymous, but the research is extraordinary. Marcus, I want you to lead the preliminary investigation." I watched my husband's face light up with pride and ambition. The irony was perfect. He was being tasked with investigating business opportunities created by his own wife, using research conducted by teams I'd assembled and managed. His success in this assignment would be guaranteed because I would be feeding him information through carefully orchestrated channels. "I'm honored by your confidence," Marcus said, his voice carrying that practiced humility that masked his hunger for power. "I won't disappoint you." "I know you won't," Richard replied. "Your insights into consumer psychology have been invaluable lately. This project could be your ticket to senior partner." "Your insights." The phrase echoed in my head as I watched Marcus accept congratulations from his colleagues. Every insight he'd shared, every breakthrough analysis, every strategic recommendation had originated from my research and been delivered to him through pillow talk disguised as casual curiosity. But the most delicious part of the irony was still to come. The Southeast Asian opportunities Marcus would be investigating were real, substantial, and profitable, but they all led back to partnerships with companies I controlled. His success would make him wealthy and powerful, but it would also make him completely dependent on the business empire his unemployable wife had built in secret. I closed the surveillance feeds and turned to my primary workstation, pulling up the timeline for Operation Mirror. Named for the way it would reflect Marcus's own behavior back at him, the operation was designed to be a gradual revelation rather than a sudden shock. Over the next 6 months, Marcus would experience a series of professional triumphs, each one seemingly validating his talent and vision. He would gain recognition, wealth, and status within Sterling & Associates and the broader business community. And then, when his ego had reached its peak and his success seemed unshakable, I would begin to pull back the curtain. Slowly at first, then with increasing velocity, until the man who had spent 3 years dismissing my abilities was forced to confront the reality that every aspect of his achievement had been orchestrated by the woman he'd underestimated. A notification appeared on my screen. Marcus was requesting emergency consultation from Dr. Sarah Chen regarding consumer psychology trends in Southeast Asian markets. He had no idea he was asking his wife for professional advice, just as he had no idea that Dr. Chen commanded consulting fees of $50,000 per session. I approved the consultation request, scheduling it for the following week under my usual conditions: audio-only communication, encrypted channels, and payment in advance. Marcus would spend the next several days preparing questions for the mysterious Dr. Chen, never suspecting that his wife was already preparing the answers that would make his career. The game was accelerating, just as David had predicted. Marcus's ambition was driving him to seek more sophisticated expertise, more cutting-edge insights, more innovative strategies. Each request for help would lead him deeper into the maze I'd constructed, until he was completely dependent on resources I controlled. I thought about the conversation at dinner the night before, about Richard Sterling's dismissive attitude toward the anonymous consultants who created innovative ideas. Soon, Marcus would discover that the anonymous consultant he'd been working with was closer than he'd ever imagined. The question wasn't whether he would recognize my genius, it was whether his ego could survive the revelation that his success had been built on the foundation of my brilliance. I checked the time. In approximately 6 hours, Marcus would come home, eager to share news of his new assignment and seek my supportive listening as he worked through the challenges ahead. I would play my role perfectly, asking naive questions that would help him process the information while secretly guiding him toward the conclusions I needed him to reach. Tonight, he would go to sleep believing himself to be on the verge of the breakthrough that would define his career. Tomorrow, he would wake up and begin the investigation that would ultimately lead him back to me. And every step of that journey would be a reminder that the woman he'd dismissed as a supportive spouse was actually the architect of everything he'd achieved. The perfect facade was about to become the perfect trap, and Marcus, blinded by his own ambition and prejudice, was walking into it with eager steps. After all, the most effective traps are the ones that feel like opportunities, and I had spent 3 years making sure that Marcus's greatest opportunity would also be his most profound humiliation. The consultation with Dr. Sarah Chen was scheduled for next Tuesday. I wondered if Marcus would recognize his wife's voice when success came calling. Tuesday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency of a well-orchestrated plan. Marcus had been preparing for his consultation with Dr. Sarah Chen for 3 days, filling legal pads with questions and theories, practicing his presentation in front of our bedroom mirror. He had no idea that I'd been watching him through the discreet cameras I'd installed during our last renovation, documenting every stolen insight he planned to present as his own original thinking. "I'm nervous," he admitted over breakfast, adjusting his tie for the 5th time. "Dr. Chen's reputation is legendary. Richard says she charges $50,000 for a single session, but her insights have revolutionized 3 different industries." I buttered my toast carefully, hiding my amusement. "What exactly will you discuss with her?" "Consumer behavior patterns in Southeast Asian markets," Marcus replied, scrolling through his notes on his tablet. "Cultural factors that influence purchasing decisions, the role of social media in brand loyalty, emerging demographic trends, heavy stuff that I'd been researching for 2 years as part of Chen Enterprises' expansion strategy." Every question on his list had already been answered in reports sitting in my hidden office, compiled by teams of analysts I'd assembled across 5 countries. "You'll do wonderfully," I said with the supportive smile he expected. "You have such a natural understanding of psychology." "That's what Richard keeps saying," Marcus agreed, his confidence returning. "He thinks my insights into consumer behavior could reshape Sterling's entire Pacific Rim strategy." "Your insights." The phrase that had become my personal punchline. I watched him gather his materials, organizing the stolen fragments of my research that he'd cobbled together into what he believed was a coherent strategy. The consultation would last exactly 90 minutes, during which I would simultaneously validate his ego and expose the massive gaps in his understanding. After Marcus left for the office, I retreated to my hidden workspace and began my transformation. Dr. Sarah Chen wasn't just a pseudonym, she was a completely different persona, backed by years of academic credentials, published research, and a carefully cultivated reputation in consulting circles. Her voice was slightly deeper than mine, her speaking patterns more formal, her knowledge demonstrably superior to anyone else in her field. I tested the voice modulation software one final time, ensuring that even the most sophisticated audio analysis wouldn't connect Dr. Chen to Sarah Morrison, Marcus's supportive wife. The irony was perfect. The same technology I'd developed for Chen Enterprises' security division was now helping me maintain the fiction that my husband's success depended on external expertise. At precisely 2 p.m., my secure line chimed with an incoming call. Marcus's voice came through clear and slightly nervous, exactly as I'd expected. "Dr. Chen, this is Marcus Morrison from Sterling & Associates. Thank you for making time in your schedule." "Mr. Morrison," I replied, my voice carrying the authority of someone who commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents. "I've reviewed your preliminary materials. Quite ambitious project you're undertaking." "Thank you. Richard Sterling speaks very highly of your work. We're hoping you can provide insights that will help us navigate the complexities of Southeast Asian consumer psychology. I pulled up the comprehensive files I'd prepared, documents that contained more detailed market intelligence than Marcus could access through Sterling's resources. The next 90 minutes would be a masterclass in manipulation. I would give him exactly what he needed to succeed while ensuring he remained completely dependent on expertise he couldn't replicate. Let's begin with your fundamental premise, I said, reviewing his submitted questions. You've suggested that Western marketing strategies can be adapted for Asian markets through cultural translation. What evidence supports this assumption? The silence stretched for several seconds. Marcus was clearly consulting his notes, searching for an answer to a question that exposed the shallow foundation of his preparation. Well, he began hesitantly, our research indicates that consumer psychology follows certain universal patterns. Brand loyalty, social influence, status consciousness, these appear to be consistent across cultures. Interesting theory, I replied, though my tone suggested otherwise. Have you examined the role of collectivist versus individualist cultural orientations in purchasing decisions? The data suggests your universal patterns may be more limited than you realize. I could hear him scrambling through papers, probably searching for information he didn't possess. The collectivist-individualist framework was fundamental to cross-cultural consumer psychology, something any legitimate expert would know instinctively. Phase 2 involved revealing the depth of my corporate network to Marcus, but not its connection to me. Over the next month, he would discover that every major player in Southeast Asian markets had some connection to Chen Enterprises, my primary holding company. He would realize that success in the region required partnership with my organization, never suspecting that the mysterious Sarah Chen who controlled those partnerships was sitting across from him at dinner each night. I pulled up the surveillance feeds from Sterling and Associates, watching Marcus return to the conference room where Richard Sterling waited for his report. His expression was confident but focused, the look of someone who had gained valuable intelligence but understood its complexity. How did it go? Richard asked as Marcus settled into his chair. Remarkable, Marcus replied, consulting his notes. Chen confirmed that our basic approach was sound, but she identified several critical factors we hadn't considered. Cultural psychology is far more complex than we realized, such as the collectivist-individualist framework fundamentally changes how consumer loyalty develops, Marcus began, essentially reciting my lecture from an hour earlier. We need to segment markets based on cultural identification rather than traditional demographics. I watched Richard's face light up with interest as Marcus continued sharing insights that had cost Chen Enterprises millions of dollars and years of research to develop. The stolen knowledge was being presented with the confidence of original thinking, exactly as I'd predicted. This could revolutionize our entire Pacific strategy, Richard said when Marcus finished. Dr. Chen's consultation was worth every penny. She's agreed to provide ongoing consultation as we develop implementation strategies, Marcus added. Though she warned that this level of cultural analysis requires significant expertise we don't currently possess, Richard observed. Exactly. We'll need to partner with organizations that have established networks in these markets. The setup was perfect. Marcus was essentially recommending that Sterling and Associates pursue partnerships with companies I controlled, using intelligence I'd provided to justify the need for my own services. He was becoming the unwitting architect of his own dependence on my business empire. I want you to begin immediate research on potential partners, Richard instructed. Focus on organizations with proven track records in cultural analysis and market penetration. Already on it, Marcus replied, pulling out his tablet. I've identified several candidates for preliminary investigation. I smiled, knowing that every organization on his list would eventually trace back to Chen Enterprises or one of its subsidiaries. Marcus would spend weeks researching companies I owned, analyzing their success stories, and ultimately recommending partnerships that would make me wealthier while validating his expertise. That evening, Marcus came home glowing with professional pride. He'd spent the afternoon researching Southeast Asian markets, apparently uncovering opportunities that excited both him and his superiors. He had no idea that every discovery had been carefully planted in databases I controlled. How was your consultation? I asked over dinner, maintaining the supportive wife facade. Incredible, Marcus replied, his enthusiasm genuine. Dr. Chen is probably the most brilliant strategist I've ever encountered. Her insights into consumer psychology are revolutionary. What did you learn? Marcus launched into a detailed summary of our conversation, essentially repeating my lecture back to me with the excitement of someone who believed he was sharing newly acquired knowledge. I nodded along appropriately, asking naive questions that helped him process the information while secretly evaluating how well he'd absorbed the material. The cultural framework she described could transform how Sterling approaches international markets, he continued. Richard is already talking about expansion timelines and partnership strategies. It sounds complicated, I said with just the right amount of bewilderment. It is, Marcus agreed. That's why expertise like Dr. Chen's is so valuable. This isn't something you can learn from books or casual observation. It requires years of specialized experience. The irony was becoming sharper with each conversation. Marcus was inadvertently describing the exact qualifications his wife possessed while explaining why such expertise was beyond her reach. He was so invested in maintaining his intellectual superiority that he couldn't recognize genuine competence when it was sitting across the dinner table from him. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said with an encouraging smile. "You always do." "With the right guidance," Marcus corrected. Dr. Chen emphasized that implementation requires ongoing consultation. Cultural psychology isn't something you master in a few sessions. Perfect. He was already mentally preparing for months of dependence on Dr. Chen's expertise, never suspecting that every consultation would deepen his reliance on knowledge his wife had spent years developing. After dinner, I retreated to my study while Marcus prepared for the next day's research. Through my monitoring systems, I watched him compile lists of potential corporate partners, unknowingly building a directory of my own subsidiaries and shell companies. The research protocol I'd promised would arrive in his email tomorrow morning, a detailed methodology that would guide him through market analysis techniques I'd pioneered during my academic career. He would follow my instructions precisely, generating research that would appear brilliant to his colleagues while remaining completely dependent on my continued guidance. I pulled up the timeline for Operation Mirror, updating the progress markers as each element fell into place. Marcus's consultation with Dr. Chen had exceeded expectations, establishing both his dependence on external expertise and his continued dismissal of his wife's capabilities. Phase 2 would begin next week, when he discovered that every successful company in Southeast Asian markets had connections to the mysterious Chen enterprises. The most beautiful aspect of my plan was that Marcus's success would be genuine. His research would be accurate, his insights valuable, his recommendations profitable. He would become everything he'd always claimed to be, an expert in international market strategy, a respected authority on consumer psychology, a partner worthy of Sterling and Associates' most ambitious expansion. But every achievement would be built on a foundation of borrowed brilliance, guided by expertise he couldn't replicate, dependent on partnerships he didn't understand. And when the moment came for revelation, he would be forced to confront the reality that his greatest professional triumph had been orchestrated by the woman he'd consistently underestimated. The consultation had been the first note in a symphony of deception. As I prepared for bed, I could hear Marcus in his office, working late into the night on research that would ultimately lead him back to me. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new insights, and new reasons for him to marvel at his own brilliance. After all, the most effective traps are the ones that feel like success. And Marcus was succeeding beyond his wildest dreams, one stolen insight at a time. The research protocol arrived in Marcus's email at exactly 6 a.m., time to appear as though Dr. Chen had worked through the night to prepare it. I watched through my surveillance system as he discovered the 47-page document over his morning coffee, his expression shifting from curiosity to amazement as he realized the sophistication of what he'd been given. "This is incredible," he murmured to himself, scrolling through methodology charts that had taken my team 6 months to develop. "She's given me everything." Not everything, I thought, monitoring his reaction from my hidden office. Just enough to make you dependent on more. The protocol was a masterpiece of strategic manipulation. It provided Marcus with genuine research techniques that would yield valuable results, but each methodology required access to databases, cultural consultants, and analytical tools that only Chen enterprises possessed. He would quickly discover that implementing Dr. Chen's recommendations required partnerships with organizations I controlled. "Sarah," Marcus called up the stairs, "come see this." I found him in his home office, surrounded by printed pages and highlighted sections. His excitement was infectious, though he had no idea he was marveling at his wife's work. "Dr. Chen sent me the most comprehensive research framework I've ever seen," he said, gesturing to the documents spread across his desk. Look at this cultural values mapping system. It's revolutionary. I leaned over his shoulder, pretending to study diagrams I'd created during my doctoral research. It looks very complex. It is. See, this section breaks down purchasing psychology into 17 different cultural variables, each weighted according to demographic density and economic mobility. The mathematical modeling alone must have taken years to develop. How will you implement something so complicated? I asked, knowing the answer would reveal his growing dependence. Marcus paused, his enthusiasm dimming slightly. That's the challenge. Some of these methodologies require specialized databases that Sterling doesn't have access to, and the cultural consultants she recommends, I've never heard of some of these organizations. I studied the list over his shoulder, hiding my smile. Every consultant and database he was reading about belonged to subsidiaries of Chen Enterprises. Marcus was looking at a directory of my own resources without realizing it. Data Flow Analytics, he read aloud. Singapore Cultural Research Institute, Pacific Consumer Intelligence. These aren't typical consulting firms. They seem to specialize in exactly what Dr. Chen is describing. Maybe that's why she's so successful, I suggested innocently. She knows which partners to work with. Exactly, Marcus agreed, pulling out his phone. I need to start making contact with these organizations immediately. If Sterling is going to compete at this level, we need access to these kinds of resources. Over the next 3 days, I watched Marcus dive into research with an intensity I hadn't seen since our early dating period. He contacted every organization on Dr. Chen's list, scheduled preliminary consultations, and began building what he believed was a network of strategic partners. What he was actually doing was mapping the structure of my business empire, one phone call at a time. I had the most interesting conversation today, he announced over dinner Wednesday evening. Data Flow Analytics agreed to a consultation about their cultural values database. Turns out they have the most comprehensive consumer psychology data in Southeast Asia. Data Flow Analytics was one of my earliest acquisitions, purchased 3 years ago specifically to support Chen Enterprises' expansion into psychological market research. The database Marcus was so excited about contained information I'd been collecting since my graduate studies. What did they tell you? I asked, cutting my salmon into precise pieces. Their methodology is remarkably similar to Dr. Chen's recommendations, Marcus replied, almost like they've worked together before. The consultant I spoke with, Dr. Jennifer Liu, seemed to know Dr. Chen's research intimately. Dr. Jennifer Liu was actually Dr. Jennifer Chen, my younger sister and the operational director of Data Flow Analytics. She'd been briefed on Marcus's project and instructed to appear impressed by his grasp of concepts I'd taught him. That's convenient, I observed. More than convenient, it suggests Dr. Chen has relationships throughout the industry that could benefit Sterling's expansion. Richard is already talking about fast-tracking our timeline based on these partnerships. I nodded appropriately while mentally reviewing the coordination required to maintain this illusion. Jennifer would need to continue playing her role perfectly, feeding Marcus information that validated his stolen insights while gradually revealing the interconnected nature of our network. Friday morning brought the breakthrough I'd been orchestrating. Marcus burst into the kitchen while I was preparing his breakfast, waving his phone with barely contained excitement. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice pitched high with discovery. "I've been researching potential partners for our Southeast Asian expansion, and there's this company called Chen Enterprises that seems to have connections with every major player in the region." I nearly dropped the orange juice pitcher. Chen Enterprises? Singapore-based conglomerate with interests in technology, real estate, and strategic consulting. They're like the invisible hand behind half the successful Western companies operating in Southeast Asia. Look at this. Marcus showed me his tablet, displaying a carefully curated website that revealed selected aspects of Chen Enterprises' operations. The site was designed to impress potential partners while maintaining strategic ambiguity about ownership and full scope. They've facilitated partnerships for companies entering Asian markets, provided cultural consulting for major acquisitions, and their investment portfolio reads like a who's who of successful international expansion, Marcus continued. The mysterious part is that no one seems to know who actually runs the company. Mysterious how? I asked, though I knew exactly how mysterious I'd made my primary holding company appear. The CEO is listed as S. Chen, but there are no photos, no interviews, no public appearances. Some industry insiders think it might be a consortium rather than an individual. Others believe S. Chen is a reclusive genius who prefers to operate behind the scenes. I allowed myself a small smile at the reclusive genius description. What does this have to do with your project? Everything, Marcus replied, his excitement building again. Every organization Dr. Chen recommended has some connection to Chen Enterprises, Data Flow Analytics, Subsidiary, Singapore Cultural Research Institute, Strategic Partner, Pacific Consumer Intelligence, Joint Venture. It's like Dr. Chen has been guiding me toward this network all along. The web was tightening exactly as planned. Marcus was beginning to understand that success in Southeast Asian markets required access to resources controlled by Chen Enterprises, but he still had no idea that Chen was sitting across from him in her bathrobe, pretending to be fascinated by his discoveries. Have you told Richard about this? I asked. I'm presenting to the full partnership committee this afternoon, Marcus replied. Richard thinks this could be the breakthrough that positions Sterling as a major player in Pacific markets. That afternoon, I watched the presentation through Sterling & Associates' conference room cameras. Marcus had prepared a comprehensive overview of Southeast Asian opportunities, supported by research methodologies that made him appear brilliantly innovative. His colleagues were visibly impressed as he outlined cultural frameworks and market penetration strategies that had taken my teams years to develop. The key insight, Marcus explained, pointing to charts I'd created, is that successful expansion requires partnerships with organizations that have established cultural intelligence networks, and all roads lead to Chen Enterprises. Richard Sterling leaned forward, his silver hair catching the conference room lighting. What do we know about this Chen? Very little, Marcus admitted. The company maintains extraordinary privacy, but their track record speaks for itself. Every major Western expansion into Southeast Asia in the last 5 years has involved Chen Enterprises in some capacity. Interesting, Richard mused. Have you attempted direct contact? Chen Enterprises doesn't accept unsolicited partnership proposals, Marcus replied, reading from information my team had provided. They evaluate potential partners through preliminary assessments conducted by approved consulting networks, such as Dr. Chen's organization. Exactly. Dr. Chen appears to be one of the few consultants with direct access to Chen Enterprises' partnership evaluation process. The setup was perfect. Marcus was essentially explaining to his superiors that their success depended on maintaining their relationship with Dr. Chen, who had exclusive access to the resources they needed. He was building the cage of his own dependence without realizing it. I recommend we deepen our consulting relationship with Dr. Chen, Marcus continued. Her insights have been invaluable, and her connections could be the key to accessing Chen Enterprises' network. Richard nodded approvingly. How much would such an expanded consulting arrangement cost? Dr. Chen's standard rate is $50,000 per session, but for a comprehensive partnership development program we'd be looking at approximately $2 million over 6 months. $2 million. Marcus was proposing that Sterling & Associates pay his wife $2 million to help them gain access to companies his wife already owned. The irony was so perfect that I had to step away from my monitors to collect myself. Approved, Richard said without hesitation. If Chen Enterprises is the gateway to Southeast Asian markets, then Dr. Chen is our most valuable consultant. After the meeting, I watched Marcus call Dr. Chen from his office, his voice carrying a mixture of professional respect and personal excitement. The conversation was brief but significant. He was requesting an expanded consulting arrangement focused specifically on accessing Chen Enterprises' partnership network. Dr. Chen, this is Marcus Morrison from Sterling & Associates. I need to discuss an expanded consulting relationship. Mr. Morrison, I replied through my voice modulation system, I understand you've made some discoveries about the strategic landscape. Chen Enterprises, Marcus said simply, your recommendations led me directly to them. It's like you've been building toward this revelation all along. Chen is a remarkable individual, I replied carefully. Chen Enterprises represents the most sophisticated approach to cross-cultural business development in the region. Can you facilitate an introduction? I paused, allowing the silence to build tension. Chen Enterprises is extremely selective about partnerships. The evaluation process is comprehensive. What would that involve? 6 months of intensive cultural assessment, market analysis, and strategic development. My role would be to prepare Sterling & Associates for the evaluation process and guide you through Chen Enterprises' partnership requirements. The partnership committee has approved a comprehensive consulting arrangement, Marcus said. We're prepared to invest significantly in this opportunity. $2 million over 6 months, I stated, making it sound like a fact rather than a quote. Agreed, Marcus replied without hesitation. After ending the call, I sat in my hidden office contemplating the beautiful complexity of what I'd created. Marcus had just convinced his company to pay me $2 million to help them gain access to partnerships with companies I already owned. He would spend the next 6 months learning about my business empire, gradually discovering that every successful venture in his target markets traced back to the mysterious Chen, never realizing he was researching his wife's achievements. That evening, Marcus came home glowing with professional triumph. Sterling and Associates had approved the largest consulting contract in the company's history, positioning him as the architect of their Pacific expansion strategy. Today was a breakthrough, he announced over dinner. Richard actually used the word visionary to describe my research approach. That's wonderful, I replied, raising my wine glass in celebration. You must be very proud. I am, but I'm also humbled, Marcus said, his tone becoming more serious. Working with Dr. Chen has shown me how much I still have to learn. Her insights into Southeast Asian markets are extraordinary, and this Chen Enterprises connection, it's like discovering a hidden layer of the business world. Hidden how? Marcus set down his fork, his expression thoughtful. They operate with complete anonymity, but their influence is everywhere. Companies that partner with Chen Enterprises see average revenue increases of 300% within 2 years. Their cultural consulting has revolutionized how Western businesses approach Asian markets, and yet nobody knows who Chen actually is. Maybe anonymity is part of their strategy, I suggested. Probably. Dr. Chen mentioned that Chen values privacy above recognition. Apparently, they're more interested in building successful partnerships than seeking public credit. I nodded, though internally I was marveling at how accurately Marcus was describing my actual business philosophy. After years of watching him take credit for my ideas, I had indeed developed a preference for invisible influence over public recognition. The next 6 months are going to be intense, Marcus continued. Dr. Chen's consulting program will basically rebuild Sterling's entire approach to international expansion. If we can secure a partnership with Chen Enterprises, it could transform the company. It sounds like a lot of pressure, I observed. It is, but it's also the opportunity of a lifetime, Marcus replied. Richard thinks this could make me the youngest senior partner in Sterling's history. I smiled at his excitement, though part of me was calculating exactly how his promotion would fit into the later phases of Operation Mirror. A senior partnership would make his eventual revelation even more devastating, but it would also provide him with resources I could manipulate for the final stages of my plan. Dr. Chen seems very important to your success, I said carefully. Absolutely critical, Marcus agreed. Without her guidance, we'd never have discovered the Chen Enterprises connection. She's probably the most brilliant strategic mind I've ever encountered. The most brilliant strategic mind he'd ever encountered was sitting across from him, pretending to be impressed by his second-hand insights. But Marcus was so invested in maintaining his intellectual superiority that he couldn't recognize genius when it shared his bed every night. As we finished dinner, I began planning the next phase of his education. Over the coming weeks, Marcus would dive deeper into research about Chen Enterprises, gradually discovering the scope and sophistication of my business empire. Each discovery would increase his respect for the mysterious Chen, while reinforcing his dismissive attitude toward his wife's capabilities. The web I'd been weaving for 3 years was finally taking its intended shape. Marcus was becoming genuinely successful, but his success was entirely dependent on access to resources I controlled. He was gaining recognition for brilliance I'd provided, building a career on foundations I'd constructed, and pursuing partnerships with companies I owned. And through it all, he continued to view his wife as a supportive but intellectually limited partner, someone who asked naive questions and required patient explanations of business concepts she couldn't possibly understand. The irony was becoming sharper with each passing day. Soon, Marcus would discover that every aspect of his greatest professional achievement traced back to the woman he'd consistently underestimated, but that revelation was still months away. For now, I would continue playing my dual role, feeding him insights as Dr. Chen while maintaining my facade as his admiring wife. After all, the most satisfying traps are the ones that feel like success right up until the moment they spring closed, and Marcus was succeeding brilliantly, one borrowed insight at a time. 3 weeks into the intensive consulting program, Marcus had transformed into something resembling a genuine expert. His office at Sterling and Associates overflowed with cultural analysis reports, market penetration studies, and partnership evaluation frameworks, all derived from my research and delivered through Dr. Chen's carefully orchestrated sessions. Watching him present my findings to impressed colleagues had become both fascinating and infuriating. The psychological triggers for brand loyalty in Malaysian markets differ significantly from Singapore. Marcus explained to the partnership committee, reading directly from notes he'd taken during our last consultation. Economic nationalism plays a larger role in purchasing decisions, particularly among the emerging middle class. An interesting interpretation, I said carefully. What led you to that conclusion? The pattern analysis you taught me. Every successful Chen Enterprises partnership involves companies that demonstrated cultural learning rather than cultural imposition. They don't just adapt their products for Asian markets, they adapt their entire approach to business relationships. Marcus spent the next 30 minutes elaborating on insights that were essentially sophisticated summaries of my doctoral dissertation, delivered with the confidence of original thinking. I provided guidance and validation while privately marveling at how thoroughly he'd absorbed my research without recognizing its source. Dr. Chen, there's something I need to ask, Marcus said as our session neared its end. My research has led me to some interesting discoveries about Chen personally. Nothing invasive, he added quickly, but there are patterns in Chen Enterprises' activities that suggest remarkable consistency in leadership philosophy. My pulse quickened. What kind of patterns? The psychological frameworks underlying their partnership selections show signatures of advanced academic training. Specifically, the methodologies align with cutting-edge research in cross-cultural psychology. Chen isn't just a brilliant business person, they're probably a trained behavioral scientist. Marcus had unknowingly profiled his own wife with startling accuracy. His analysis of Chen Enterprises' decision-making patterns had led him to conclude that Chen possessed exactly the qualifications that Dr. Sarah Morrison had earned through years of graduate study. Interesting theory, I replied, though my mind was racing. What evidence supports this conclusion? The sophistication of their cultural assessment protocols, the mathematical modeling underlying their market analysis, the systematic approach to partnership evaluation. This isn't intuitive business sense, it's empirical methodology applied to commercial relationships. I paused, genuinely impressed by his analytical skills. When Marcus focused his intelligence on problems that interested him, rather than simply appropriating others' insights, he was capable of remarkable deductive reasoning. You're suggesting Chen has formal academic credentials in behavioral psychology? I asked. Probably a doctorate, Marcus replied confidently. The research methodologies embedded in Chen Enterprises' operations are too sophisticated for informal training. Someone with Chen's capabilities likely has extensive academic background, probably including published research in cross-cultural psychology. He was describing me with uncanny precision, building a psychological profile of his wife without realizing it. The irony was becoming almost unbearable. Have you shared this analysis with your colleagues? I asked. Not yet. I wanted to verify my conclusions with you first, but if I'm correct about Chen's background, it could help Sterling tailor our partnership approach more effectively. That evening, Marcus came home buzzing with intellectual excitement. He'd spent the afternoon researching academic publications in cross-cultural psychology, searching for clues about Chen's educational background. His dining room table was covered with printed journal articles, university directories, and conference proceedings. You seem energized, I observed, setting down his dinner plate. I'm working on a puzzle, Marcus replied, gesturing to his research materials. Dr. Chen's insights have led me to some fascinating conclusions about the mysterious Chen who runs Chen Enterprises. What kind of conclusions? I asked, though I was fairly certain I knew where his investigation was heading. Chen is almost certainly an academic, Marcus explained. Someone with advanced training in behavioral psychology, probably with published research in cross-cultural business applications. The methodologies underlying Chen Enterprises' success are too sophisticated for purely commercial development. I sat down across from him, genuinely curious about how far his analysis would take him. How does that help Sterling's partnership prospects? If Chen values academic rigor and empirical methodology, then our approach should emphasize research quality and theoretical sophistication rather than just financial projections and market share data. Marcus pulled out a highlighted journal article. Look at this paper from 3 years ago, Cultural Values Integration in Cross-Border Commercial Relationships. The theoretical framework is remarkably similar to Chen Enterprises' partnership selection criteria. My heart stopped. He was holding a copy of my own published research, the paper that had launched my reputation in cross-cultural psychology and provided the foundation for Chen Enterprises' analytical protocols. Who wrote it? I asked, though I could see my own name highlighted on the title page. Dr. Sarah Chen, from Stanford's Graduate School of Business, Marcus read. Published in the Journal of International Business Psychology. The methodology section reads like a blueprint for Chen Enterprises' evaluation processes. Sarah Chen. He was looking at research published under my maiden name, comparing it to business practices I'd developed, finding connections that were absolutely accurate because they were the same person's work. The web of evidence was leading him directly toward the truth, but his assumptions about his wife's capabilities were blinding him to the obvious conclusion. Do you think there's a connection? I asked carefully. Possibly, Marcus replied, flipping through the article. Dr. Sarah Chen's research focuses exactly on the problems Chen Enterprises solves for their partners. The timing works too. This paper was published just before Chen Enterprises began their rapid expansion. I watched him analyze my academic work, searching for clues about Chen's identity while completely missing the fact that the author was sitting 3 feet away from him. His investigation was thorough and methodical, but his fundamental assumptions about my intellectual limitations created a massive blind spot in his reasoning. Maybe Chen is this Dr. Sarah Chen, I suggested, testing whether he would make the connection. Marcus shook his head dismissively. Unlikely. This Dr. Chen is based in California, and her research is purely academic. Chen built a billion-dollar business empire across Southeast Asia. Different skill sets entirely. My husband was explaining why his wife, a woman with a doctorate in behavioral psychology and 3 years of postgraduate business research, couldn't possibly be the same person as the academic whose work he was studying with genuine admiration. Besides, Marcus continued, Dr. Chen's insights suggest that Chen has been operating in Southeast Asian markets for at least a decade. This Dr. Sarah Chen would have been in graduate school during the early development of Chen Enterprises. I nodded, though internally I was marveling at how close he was coming to the truth, while simultaneously explaining why the truth was impossible. His timeline analysis was actually incorrect. Chen Enterprises had been built more recently than he realized, but his assumption that academic research and business success were mutually exclusive was preventing him from considering the obvious explanation. What's your next step? I asked. Dr. Chen is arranging a preliminary assessment call with Chen Enterprises next week, Marcus replied. It's not a direct meeting with Chen, but it's the first formal evaluation of Sterling's partnership potential. The preliminary assessment call would be conducted by David Kim, my most trusted advisor and the only person besides my sister who knew the complete scope of Operation Mirror. David would play his role perfectly, evaluating Sterling and Associates with appropriate skepticism while gradually revealing the depth and sophistication of Chen Enterprises' operations. Are you nervous? I asked. Excited more than nervous, Marcus admitted. This represents everything I've been working toward. If Sterling can secure a partnership with Chen Enterprises, it validates not just our expansion strategy but my entire approach to international business development. His entire approach, which was actually my approach, implemented through methodologies I'd developed and guided by insights I'd provided. Marcus's success was becoming increasingly authentic, but it remained entirely dependent on continued access to expertise he couldn't replicate. Over the weekend, I watched Marcus prepare for the assessment call with an intensity that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him initially. When he focused his intelligence on genuine challenges rather than appropriating others' work, he was genuinely impressive. His preparation was thorough, his analysis insightful, and his strategy presentations were polished and persuasive. The tragedy was that all of this capability had been directed toward taking credit for my innovations rather than developing his own expertise. But now, 3 years into our marriage and deep into Operation Mirror, Marcus was finally becoming the business strategist he'd always claimed to be. Sunday evening, as he reviewed his notes for the assessment call, Marcus made an observation that sent chills down my spine. You know what's interesting, he said, looking up from his preparation materials. Dr. Chen's teaching style reminds me of someone, but I can't place who. What do you mean? I asked, though I was afraid I knew exactly what he meant. The way she structures information, the questions she asks to guide analysis, the systematic approach to complex problems, it's familiar somehow, like I've encountered this methodology before. I held my breath, wondering if 3 years of stolen insights were finally creating enough pattern recognition for Marcus to connect Dr. Chen's expertise to conversations he'd had with his wife. Maybe it's just effective teaching, I suggested carefully. Maybe, Marcus agreed, though his expression remained thoughtful. It's probably just that her approach aligns with my natural analytical style. Great minds think alike, and all that. Great minds think alike. My husband was crediting his affinity for my teaching methods to intellectual compatibility, rather than recognizing that he was being taught by the same person whose ideas he'd been appropriating for years. The assessment call was scheduled for 10 a.m. Monday morning. As I prepared for bed Sunday night, I reviewed the strategy David and I had developed for gradually revealing Chen Enterprises' true scope. The call would plant seeds of information that would grow into revelations over the following weeks, each discovery bringing Marcus closer to understanding the real source of his professional transformation. But those revelations were still carefully controlled, designed to maintain the fiction that his success depended on external partnerships rather than his wife's invisible guidance. The moment of complete truth was still months away, timed for maximum psychological impact when Marcus's ego had reached its absolute peak. For now, I would continue playing my dual role, feeding him insights as Dr. Chen, while supporting him as his admiring wife. The investigation he was conducting into Chen's identity was leading him directly toward me, but his assumptions about my capabilities remained the perfect camouflage. After all, sometimes the best place to hide is in plain sight, especially when the person searching is convinced you couldn't possibly be what they're looking for. The assessment call began at precisely 10 a.m., with Marcus seated in Sterling & Associates' executive conference room, surrounded by 3 senior partners and enough preparation materials to stock a small library. I watched through concealed cameras while simultaneously monitoring David Kim's approach from my hidden office, coordinating every aspect of what would appear to be an independent evaluation of Sterling's partnership potential. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison." David's voice came through the conference room speakers, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to conducting high-stakes business negotiations. "I'm David Kim, Director of Strategic Partnerships for Chen Enterprises. I understand Dr. Chen has been preparing Sterling & Associates for this preliminary assessment." "Good morning, Mr. Kim," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the nervous energy I could read in his posture. "We're honored by Chen Enterprises' consideration. Dr. Chen's guidance has been invaluable in helping us understand the sophistication of your partnership requirements." David had perfected his role over 3 years of representing my interests in various business negotiations. His tone conveyed polite skepticism mixed with professional courtesy, exactly the attitude that would make Marcus work harder to prove Sterling's worthiness. "Dr. Chen's reputation for thorough preparation is well-deserved," David observed. "However, preparation and implementation are distinctly different challenges. Chen Enterprises has observed many organizations that excel in theoretical understanding but struggle with practical execution." I watched Marcus straighten in his chair, recognizing the implicit challenge. Richard Sterling leaned forward, his silver hair catching the conference room lighting as he prepared to defend their capabilities. "We understand that Chen Enterprises values demonstrated competence over theoretical knowledge," Richard said. "Marcus has developed comprehensive frameworks for cultural integration that go well beyond standard market entry strategies." "I'd like to hear Mr. Morrison's analysis directly," David replied, smoothly redirecting attention to Marcus. "Dr. Chen's reports indicate promising development in your approach to cross-cultural business relationships." Marcus opened his presentation folder, pulling out charts and frameworks that represented months of intensive study, guided by my expertise. As he began explaining his understanding of Southeast Asian market dynamics, I felt a complex mixture of pride and frustration. He was genuinely impressive when presenting material I'd taught him, but he delivered it with the confidence of original discovery. "The key insight," Marcus explained, "is that successful market penetration requires what I call authentic cultural integration. Western companies can't simply adapt their products for Asian markets, they must adapt their entire approach to relationship building and business hierarchy." Authentic cultural integration. The phrase was lifted directly from my doctoral dissertation, but Marcus presented it as his own conceptual breakthrough. David played his role perfectly, asking probing questions that demonstrated both interest and skepticism. "Can you provide specific examples of this integration methodology?" David asked. Marcus launched into case studies that were essentially summaries of Chen Enterprises' most successful partnerships. information he'd gained through Dr. Chen's consulting sessions. He described our expansion into Malaysian technology markets, our partnership development in Singapore's financial sector, and our cultural consulting work with Indonesian manufacturing companies, all presented as external research rather than internal intelligence. Impressive analysis, David acknowledged after Marcus finished his presentation. Your understanding of our operational philosophy shows remarkable sophistication. Dr. Chen's guidance has been transformative, Marcus admitted, his honesty both refreshing and ironic. Working with her has elevated my understanding of cross-cultural business development beyond anything I achieved independently. Finally, a moment of genuine humility. Marcus was acknowledging that his expertise depended on external guidance, though he still had no idea that the guidance came from his wife. Dr. Chen speaks highly of your analytical capabilities, David continued. However, Chen Enterprises requires more than analytical competence. We evaluate potential partners based on what Chen calls cultural authenticity, the ability to build genuine relationships rather than strategic alliances disguised as partnerships. Cultural authenticity was another concept I developed during my academic research, refined through years of practical application in Southeast Asian markets. David was essentially testing Marcus's understanding of my own business philosophy, using my wife's theoretical framework to evaluate her husband's worthiness as a partner. How does Chen Enterprises assess cultural authenticity? Patricia Mills asked. Extended observation of actual business practices, David replied. Chen believes that cultural compatibility can only be evaluated through sustained interaction. We monitor how potential partners handle cultural challenges, adapt to feedback, and demonstrate genuine respect for Southeast Asian business values. Are we currently under such observation? Richard asked directly. David paused, creating dramatic tension. Chen Enterprises has been monitoring Sterling & Associates' development for several months. Your engagement with Dr. Chen's consulting program is part of our assessment process. I smiled at the elegant truth of David's statement. Chen Enterprises, meaning me, had indeed been monitoring Sterling & Associates for several months, though the monitoring had begun long before they knew Chen Enterprises existed. What have your observations indicated? Marcus asked, his voice carrying carefully controlled anxiety. Promising development, David replied diplomatically. However, Chen has noted some concerns about Sterling's internal culture that require further evaluation. Internal culture concerns. David was referring to documentation I'd compiled about Marcus's habit of appropriating colleagues' ideas, his dismissive attitude toward female staff members, and his tendency to take disproportionate credit for collaborative work. The concerns were genuine, though their resolution was already planned as part of Operation Mirror. What specific concerns? Richard pressed. Intellectual property attribution and collaborative recognition practices, David stated plainly. Chen Enterprises has observed instances where individual team members receive disproportionate credit for collaborative achievements. The conference room fell silent. Marcus's face flushed slightly as he realized David was diplomatically describing exactly the behavior that had characterized his career advancement. Richard's expression grew thoughtful. He was clearly reviewing his own observations of Marcus's attribution practices. We take intellectual honesty very seriously, Richard said carefully. If there have been attribution issues, we're committed to addressing them immediately. Chen appreciates that commitment, David replied. However, cultural change requires sustained effort rather than policy adjustments. Chen Enterprises prefers partners who demonstrate authentic collaboration rather than competitive individualism. I watched Marcus process this feedback, seeing his confusion as he tried to reconcile his personal advancement strategy with Chen Enterprises' partnership requirements. For 3 years, he'd built his career by appropriating others' insights and presenting them as individual achievements. Now his greatest professional opportunity required exactly the opposite approach. How can Sterling demonstrate authentic collaboration? Marcus asked. By implementing the cultural integration methodologies you've described, David replied. Dr. Chen's frameworks aren't just theoretical models, they're practical tools for transforming organizational culture. Sterling's commitment to partnership with Chen Enterprises will be evaluated based on your internal implementation of these collaborative principles. The trap was closing with mathematical precision. Marcus would need to implement my collaborative methodologies within Sterling & Associates, essentially rebuilding their corporate culture according to principles his wife had developed. His success would require him to abandon the competitive individualism that had defined his career and embrace the authentic collaboration that characterized my business philosophy. We're prepared to implement comprehensive cultural reforms, Richard announced. Marcus will lead the transformation process, working directly with Dr. Chen to ensure proper execution. Excellent, David replied. Chen will be pleased to hear of Sterling's commitment to authentic cultural development. After the call ended, I watched through surveillance feeds as the Sterling partnership engaged in intense discussion about the assessment results. Marcus appeared both excited and concerned. Excited by Chen Enterprises' continued interest, but concerned about the cultural transformation requirements. They're essentially asking us to rebuild our entire approach to intellectual collaboration, Marcus said, reviewing his notes from the call. Is that problematic? Patricia asked. Marcus hesitated, and I could see him calculating the personal implications of authentic collaboration practices. His career advancement had depended on individual recognition for collaborative work. Implementing genuine attribution standards would expose years of intellectual appropriation. Not problematic, Marcus replied carefully, but it will require significant adjustment in how we recognize and reward individual contributions. Worth it for partnership with Chen Enterprises, Richard stated decisively. Their network could transform Sterling's international presence. That afternoon, Marcus called Dr. Chen for an emergency consultation about implementing cultural transformation within Sterling and Associates. His anxiety was palpable as he described the assessment results and Chen Enterprises' expectations. Dr. Chen, they're requiring us to implement authentic collaboration practices, Marcus explained. How do I transform Sterling's culture without compromising individual achievement recognition? Mr. Morrison, I replied through my voice modulation system. Authentic collaboration enhances rather than diminishes individual achievement. The goal isn't to eliminate recognition, but to ensure accurate attribution. But what if past attribution practices weren't perfectly accurate? I paused, allowing him to sweat as he contemplated confessing years of intellectual appropriation to the consultant whose insights had made him successful. Cultural transformation includes acknowledging past mistakes, I said carefully. Chen values honesty about attribution errors more than perfect historical records. Are you suggesting I should confess to inaccurate attribution? I'm suggesting that authentic collaboration requires transparency about intellectual contributions. Chen Enterprises monitors these practices closely. They prefer partners who demonstrate growth rather than defensiveness. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, and I could almost hear him calculating the risks of honesty versus the dangers of continued deception. His professional future now depended on abandoning the behavior patterns that had defined his career advancement. Dr. Chen, I need to ask you something confidential, Marcus said finally. Have Chen Enterprises been monitoring my individual attribution practices? Chen's assessment process is comprehensive, I replied diplomatically. Cultural authenticity evaluation includes review of intellectual property practices, collaborative recognition, and attribution accuracy. And their assessment of my practices? Room for improvement, I stated plainly. However, Chen appreciates individuals who demonstrate capacity for growth rather than defensive justification of past behavior. That evening, Marcus came home visibly shaken by the day's developments. Chen Enterprises' assessment had forced him to confront the ethical implications of his career advancement strategies, while their partnership requirements demanded fundamental changes in his professional behavior. How did the assessment go? I asked over dinner, playing the supportive wife while internally monitoring his psychological state. Complex, Marcus replied, his usual confidence replaced by contemplative uncertainty. Chen Enterprises is interested in partnership, but they're requiring significant cultural changes within Sterling. What kind of changes? Authentic collaboration practices, accurate attribution of intellectual contributions, transparent recognition of team achievements. Marcus paused, his expression troubled. They've been monitoring our internal practices, and apparently there are concerns about individual team members receiving disproportionate credit. I nodded sympathetically, though I was the one who had compiled the documentation of his attribution practices that David had referenced during the assessment. That sounds challenging, I observed. It is. Dr. Chen explained that cultural transformation includes acknowledging past attribution mistakes. Chen Enterprises values honesty about intellectual property issues more than perfect historical records. Are you planning to acknowledge past mistakes? Marcus set down his fork, his expression genuinely troubled. I may not have a choice. Chen Enterprises partnership represents the opportunity of a lifetime, but their requirements force me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my career development. Uncomfortable truths. For the first time in our marriage, Marcus was acknowledging that his professional success might not be entirely earned. The assessment had accomplished exactly what I'd intended, forcing him to choose between maintaining his false narrative and pursuing genuine achievement. "What will you do?" I asked. "Whatever Chen Enterprises requires," Marcus replied with resignation. Their partnership could transform Sterling's international presence, which means transforming my approach to professional recognition. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand, offering the support he needed while internally celebrating the psychological breakthrough he'd just experienced. Marcus was finally ready to abandon the competitive individualism that had characterized our entire relationship. "I'm proud of you for considering these changes," I said honestly. "Growth requires acknowledging past mistakes." Dr. Chen said something similar, Marcus observed. She emphasized that Chen values individuals who demonstrate capacity for growth, rather than defensive justification. Chen values individuals who demonstrate capacity for growth. Marcus was unknowingly quoting his wife's assessment of his potential for personal development, delivered through a consultant he believed was external to his marriage. The assessment had achieved its strategic objectives perfectly. Marcus now understood that his professional future depended on abandoning the behavior patterns that had defined his career, while Chen Enterprises maintained their position as the arbiters of his transformation. The next phase would involve implementing authentic collaboration practices that would expose years of intellectual appropriation while positioning him for genuine partnership with companies I controlled. But most importantly, Marcus was finally ready to become the ethical professional I'd always hoped he could be. The revelation of my true identity was still months away, but the foundation for his genuine redemption was now firmly established. After all, the most effective transformations begin with honest acknowledgement of past mistakes, and Marcus was finally ready for both honesty and transformation. The cultural transformation at Sterling & Associates began with what Marcus called the Great Reckoning, a comprehensive audit of intellectual property attribution spanning the previous 3 years. I watched from my hidden office as he voluntarily submitted to a process that would expose every instance of his appropriated insights, all in service of proving Sterling's worthiness for Chen Enterprises partnership. "We need complete transparency," Marcus announced to the partnership committee during their Monday morning meeting. "Chen Enterprises has made it clear that authentic collaboration is non-negotiable. That means acknowledging past attribution errors and implementing systematic changes to our recognition practices." Richard Sterling raised an eyebrow at the word errors but nodded approvingly. "What specific changes are you proposing?" Marcus pulled out a comprehensive reform plan that he'd developed with Dr. Chen's guidance, essentially my own framework for ethical intellectual property practices, delivered through consulting sessions and presented as his strategic insight. First, retroactive attribution review for all major projects from the last 3 years. Marcus explained, his voice steady despite what this would reveal about his own practices. Second, implementation of collaborative documentation standards that track individual contributions in real time. Third, establishment of peer review processes for all intellectual property claims. I leaned back in my chair, genuinely impressed by his commitment to transformation. The reform plan would expose years of his intellectual appropriation while ensuring that future collaborative work received accurate attribution. It was exactly the kind of ethical framework I'd hoped to see him embrace. "This level of scrutiny seems excessive," Patricia Mills observed. "Are we certain Chen Enterprises requires such comprehensive changes?" Chen's assessment methodology is reportedly exhaustive," Marcus replied. Dr. Chen emphasized that cultural authenticity can't be performed. It must be genuinely integrated into organizational practices. Over the following week, Marcus threw himself into the attribution audit with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He reviewed every presentation he'd delivered, every strategy document he'd authored, every client proposal bearing his signature. The process was clearly painful, but he approached it with methodical honesty that surprised me. "I need to discuss something with you," Marcus said during our Thursday evening consultation, his voice carrying uncharacteristic vulnerability. "The attribution audit has revealed some uncomfortable patterns in my work." "What kind of patterns?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he'd discovered. "Ideas that I presented as original insights but that actually came from collaborative discussions or external sources." Not intentional plagiarism, he added quickly, but insufficient attribution of intellectual contributions. Insufficient attribution. Marcus was diplomatically describing 3 years of systematic intellectual theft, but at least he was acknowledging the behavior rather than defending it. How significant are these attribution gaps? I pressed. Substantial, Marcus admitted after a long pause. Some of my most successful presentations included insights that originated from collaborative team discussions or informal conversations. I attributed them as individual analysis rather than collaborative development. Such as the micro-influencer marketing framework that led to Sterling's digital strategy overhaul, the cultural values integration methodology for international clients, the consumer psychology principles underlying our Southeast Asian market analysis. Marcus paused. Actually, most of my breakthrough insights trace back to collaborative sources that I didn't properly acknowledge. I sat in silence for several moments, letting him process the magnitude of what he'd just confessed. Marcus had essentially admitted that his entire reputation as a strategic innovator was built on appropriated intellectual property. Dr. Chen, I need your guidance on how to address these attribution errors without destroying my credibility. Marcus continued. Chen Enterprises values honesty, but admitting to 3 years of inadequate attribution could end my career. Morrison, I replied carefully, authentic transformation requires acknowledging past mistakes without defensive justification. Chen's evaluation process includes assessment of how individuals handle attribution corrections. Are you suggesting I should publicly acknowledge these errors? I'm suggesting that ethical leadership requires taking responsibility for intellectual property practices, regardless of personal consequences. Marcus was quiet for so long that I wondered if the call had disconnected. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a resolution I hadn't heard before. You're right. If Chen Enterprises partnership requires authentic collaboration, then I need to model that behavior by acknowledging my attribution failures. The following Monday, Marcus did something that genuinely shocked me. He called a company-wide meeting and delivered a presentation that systematically corrected 3 years of intellectual property attribution. Standing before Sterling's entire staff, he acknowledged the collaborative sources of insights he'd previously claimed as individual achievements. The micro-influencer marketing strategy that transformed our digital approach actually originated from discussions with our junior marketing team, Marcus announced, reading from prepared notes. I failed to properly attribute their contributions when presenting the framework to clients. I watched through surveillance feeds as junior staff members exchanged surprised glances. Several looked genuinely moved by Marcus's acknowledgement of their intellectual contributions. The cultural integration methodology for international clients was developed through collaborative sessions with our research department, he continued. My presentations should have emphasized the team's analytical work rather than positioning these insights as individual analysis. For 30 minutes, Marcus systematically dismantled his own reputation as a strategic innovator, redistributing credit for breakthrough insights to their actual sources. The presentation was professional suicide performed in service of ethical transformation. Moving forward, Marcus concluded, Sterling and Associates will implement comprehensive attribution standards that ensure accurate recognition of intellectual contributions. Collaboration enhances rather than diminishes individual achievement when properly acknowledged. The room erupted in spontaneous applause, not the polite recognition typical of corporate meetings, but genuine appreciation for intellectual honesty. I realized that Marcus's willingness to acknowledge his attribution failures had actually enhanced rather than damaged his leadership credibility. Richard Sterling stood up, his expression thoughtful. Marcus, this level of ethical transparency demonstrates exactly the kind of leadership that positions Sterling for international partnerships. Thank you for modeling authentic collaboration. That afternoon, Marcus called Dr. Chen with a mixture of relief and anxiety about his public confession. Dr. Chen, I've completed the attribution corrections, he reported. The response was more positive than I expected, but I'm concerned about how Chen Enterprises will evaluate my acknowledgement of past errors. Chen values ethical leadership more than perfect historical records, I replied. Your willingness to acknowledge attribution failures demonstrates exactly the kind of cultural authenticity that Chen Enterprises seeks in partners. Really? Absolutely. The most impressive aspect of your transformation isn't the correction of past mistakes, it's your commitment to implementing systematic changes that prevent future attribution errors. I could hear Marcus's relief through the phone connection. Dr. Chen, I have to ask, has Chen been monitoring my attribution practices specifically, or was this general assessment of Sterling's culture? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus was beginning to understand that Chen Enterprises' evaluation process was remarkably sophisticated, but he still had no idea how personally targeted their assessment had been. Chen's methodology includes individual evaluation of key personnel, I replied diplomatically. Cultural transformation requires leadership commitment from specific individuals, not just organizational policy changes. Individual evaluation, Marcus repeated slowly. How long has Chen been monitoring my work? Cultural assessment is an ongoing process, I said carefully. Authentic collaboration can only be evaluated through sustained observation of actual practices. Sustained observation, Marcus echoed. Dr. Chen, sometimes I feel like Chen knows more about my work than I do myself. If only he knew how accurate that observation was. Chen, meaning me, had indeed been monitoring his work more closely than he monitored it himself, documenting every appropriated insight and tracking every attribution failure for 3 years. Chen's assessment capabilities are reportedly extraordinary, I replied. Chen Enterprises' success depends on accurate evaluation of potential partners' cultural authenticity. That evening, Marcus came home transformed in ways that went beyond his professional acknowledgments. His usual confident swagger had been replaced by thoughtful humility, and for the first time in our marriage, he seemed genuinely interested in my opinions rather than seeking validation for his own insights. I did something today that I should have done years ago, he announced over dinner. I acknowledged the collaborative sources of my most successful strategies. How did that feel? I asked, though I'd monitored the entire process through surveillance feeds. Terrifying at first, then liberating, Marcus replied honestly. Dr. Chen was right. Authentic collaboration enhances rather than diminishes individual achievement. The team's response was incredibly positive. I'm proud of you for taking that step, I said, and meant it completely. There's something else, Marcus continued, his expression becoming more serious. The attribution audit revealed something disturbing about my intellectual property practices. I've been appropriating ideas without proper acknowledgement for years. This was the closest Marcus had ever come to directly acknowledging his theft of my insights. He was confessing to intellectual appropriation in general terms, still not recognizing that his wife had been the primary victim of his attribution failures. What are you going to do about that realization? I asked carefully. Change everything, Marcus replied with determination. Dr. Chen's guidance has shown me that success built on appropriated insights isn't sustainable. Chen Enterprises values authentic achievement, which means I need to develop genuine expertise rather than borrowing others' brilliance. Authentic achievement. For the first time in our marriage, Marcus was articulating the exact principle I'd hoped he would embrace. The transformation was happening faster than I'd anticipated, driven by his genuine desire to worthy of Chen Enterprises' partnership. That sounds like a significant change in approach, I observed. It is, but working with Dr. Chen has taught me that authentic expertise is more valuable than borrowed insights. I'd rather be genuinely knowledgeable about fewer topics than superficially impressive about many. I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling a complex mixture of pride and anticipation. Marcus was finally becoming the ethical professional I'd always hoped he could be, but he still had no idea that his transformation was being guided by the woman whose insights he'd been appropriating for years. Dr. Chen sounds like an exceptional consultant, I said. She is. Her guidance has been transformative, not just professionally but personally. She's helped me understand that intellectual honesty enhances rather than threatens individual achievement. Have you considered what happens after your consulting arrangement ends? Marcus paused, his expression becoming troubled. I've been avoiding that thought. Dr. Chen's insights have become integral to my analytical process. I'm not sure I can maintain this level of expertise without her continued guidance. The dependence was exactly what I'd intended to create, but hearing Marcus acknowledge it so directly was still startling. He was admitting that his professional competence depended on continued access to external expertise that came from his wife. Maybe the goal isn't independence from guidance, I suggested carefully, but learning to recognize and properly acknowledge the sources of insights when they occur. You mean developing collaborative relationships rather than seeking individual expertise? Exactly. Perhaps the most valuable skill isn't having all the answers, but knowing how to find and acknowledge the right sources of information. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Dr. Chen mentioned something similar. She emphasized that Chen's success comes from building networks of genuine collaboration rather than individual brilliance. Building networks of genuine collaboration. Marcus was unknowingly describing his wife's business philosophy while explaining why his own approach to intellectual property had been fundamentally flawed. The transformation was proceeding beautifully. Marcus had acknowledged his attribution failures, implemented systematic changes to Sterling's collaborative practices, and committed to developing authentic expertise rather than appropriating others' insights. Most importantly, he was finally ready for the kind of genuine partnership that Chen Enterprises, meaning I, had always required. But he still had no idea that every aspect of his transformation had been orchestrated by the woman he'd been underestimating for 3 years. The revelation was still weeks away, timed for the moment when his ego had fully healed from its necessary deflation and his new ethical framework was completely integrated. For now, I would continue playing my dual role, guiding his transformation as Dr. Chen while supporting his growth as his wife. The man who had built his career on stolen insights was finally learning to create authentic value, one properly attributed idea at a time. After all, the most satisfying transformations are the ones that create genuine improvement rather than just delivering punishment. And Marcus was improving in ways that would make both his professional success and our marriage more authentic than either had ever been before. 6 months after beginning the Chen Enterprises partnership evaluation, Marcus had transformed Sterling and Associates into a model of collaborative excellence. The attribution practices he'd implemented had become industry standards, and his willingness to acknowledge intellectual property sources had enhanced rather than damaged his professional reputation. As I watched him deliver a presentation to potential clients, I realized that Operation Mirror had succeeded beyond my original intentions. Marcus wasn't just being punished for his past behavior, he was becoming genuinely worthy of respect. The key to sustainable international expansion, Marcus explained to the client meeting, isn't adapting Western strategies for Asian markets, but developing authentic collaborative relationships with local cultural experts. Sterling and Associates has learned this through our partnership development process with Chen Enterprises. I monitored the presentation from my hidden office, noting how Marcus now attributed insights to their actual sources and acknowledged the collaborative nature of strategic development. The man who had spent 3 years appropriating my ideas was finally creating authentic value through properly acknowledged teamwork. "Mr. Morrison," asked the client, "what makes Chen Enterprises such an effective partner in Southeast Asian markets?" "Their commitment to cultural authenticity," Marcus replied without hesitation. Chen has built an organization that values genuine relationship building over transactional arrangements. Their partnership evaluation process is comprehensive because they're assessing long-term compatibility rather than short-term profit potential. Marcus was describing my business philosophy with genuine understanding, having learned through 6 months of intensive consulting to appreciate the principles that had always guided my approach to international business development. After the successful client presentation, Richard Sterling called Marcus into his office for what would prove to be a career-defining conversation. "Marcus, the Chen Enterprises partnership has exceeded every expectation," Richard announced, settling behind his mahogany desk. "Our Southeast Asian revenue has increased 400% in 6 months, our cultural intelligence capabilities are industry-leading, and our collaborative practices have become a competitive advantage." "Dr. Chen's guidance has been transformative," Marcus replied, maintaining the humility that had characterized his leadership style since the attribution audit. "Which brings me to an interesting opportunity," Richard continued. "Chen Enterprises has invited Sterling's senior leadership to Singapore for a strategic planning summit. Chen will be attending personally." I watched Marcus's face light up with excitement and nervousness. After months of working toward Chen Enterprises partnership, he would finally meet the mysterious Chen, whose business philosophy had revolutionized his approach to international development. "When is the summit scheduled?" Marcus asked. "Next month. However, there's an interesting requirement. Chen has specifically requested that all attendees bring their spouses. Apparently, they believe that authentic partnership assessment includes evaluation of personal relationships and family dynamics." Marcus's expression shifted to concern. "My wife, Sarah, isn't really equipped for high-level business discussions. She's supportive, but she doesn't have the background to contribute meaningfully to strategic planning." I nearly laughed at the irony. Marcus was worried about bringing his wife to meet the business leader whose philosophy she had created and whose success she had orchestrated. Chen's invitation was quite specific, Richard explained. They believe that personal relationships reflect professional integrity. The assessment includes observation of how we interact with our families, not just our business associates. That evening, Marcus came home with a mixture of excitement and anxiety about the Singapore Summit invitation. He spent dinner explaining the opportunity while expressing concern about my ability to represent Sterling appropriately in such sophisticated business discussions. "Sarah, this is the culmination of everything I've been working toward," he said, pacing around our living room. "Meeting Chen could transform not just Sterling's international presence but my entire career trajectory." "That sounds wonderful," I replied, though I was mentally reviewing the logistics of revealing my identity during the Singapore summit. "There's just one complication," Marcus continued. Chen has required that all attendees bring their spouses. They want to assess our personal relationships as part of the partnership evaluation. "Are you concerned about something specific?" I asked innocently. Marcus hesitated, clearly struggling with how to express his concern diplomatically. Chen operates at an extraordinary level of business sophistication. "I'm worried that you might feel overwhelmed by the level of strategic discussion." I nodded understandingly, though internally I was savoring the irony that Marcus was worried about his wife being intellectually overwhelmed by meeting herself. "What would you like me to do to prepare?" I asked. "Maybe review some basic information about international business practices. Dr. Chen might be able to recommend some introductory materials that would help you follow the conversations." The next day, Marcus called Dr. Chen for guidance about preparing his wife for the Singapore summit. I answered the call from my hidden office, preparing to deliver the most ironic consultation of our entire relationship. "Dr. Chen, I need advice about the Singapore summit," Marcus began. "Chen has required that spouses attend, but I'm concerned about my wife's ability to contribute meaningfully to strategic discussions." "Tell me about your wife's background," I replied, curious to hear how Marcus would describe me to my own consulting persona. "Sarah is wonderful, supportive, intelligent in her own way, but she doesn't have formal business training. She asks good questions sometimes, but she lacks the foundational knowledge to understand complex strategic frameworks." Lacks the foundational knowledge. Marcus was describing his wife's intellectual limitations to his wife, who held a doctorate in the exact field they would be discussing. "Perhaps your wife's perspective would be more valuable than you realize," I suggested carefully. "Cross-cultural business development benefits from diverse analytical approaches." "I appreciate your optimism, but Sarah really doesn't understand international markets or cultural psychology. She's tried to engage with my work, but the concepts are beyond her educational background." "Mr. Morrison, Chen specifically requested spouse attendance for a reason. Perhaps you should trust their judgment about what perspectives add value to strategic discussions." After ending the call, I began planning the most elaborate revelation in corporate history. The Singapore summit would become the stage for Marcus to discover that every aspect of his professional transformation had been orchestrated by the woman he consistently underestimated. Over the following weeks, I watched Marcus prepare for the summit with intensive research about Chen enterprises, Southeast Asian markets, and cultural integration strategies. His preparation was thorough, and his insights genuinely sophisticated. The transformation from intellectual appropriator to authentic strategist was complete. Meanwhile, I coordinated with David Kim and my sister Jennifer to orchestrate the summit logistics. Every detail would contribute to the gradual revelation of my identity, from the conference room arrangements to the order of presentations. The flight to Singapore was surreal. Marcus spent the journey reviewing his notes and briefing me on Chen Enterprises' background, essentially explaining my own business empire to me as if I were learning about it for the first time. "Chen Enterprises was founded approximately 7 years ago," Marcus explained, reading from his tablet. "They've revolutionized Western approaches to Southeast Asian market entry through sophisticated cultural intelligence methodologies." 7 years ago was accurate, though Marcus didn't know that was when I'd started building my business network during graduate school. "The founder, Chen, maintains extraordinary privacy," he continued. "No photos, no interviews, no public appearances. Some analysts believe Chen might be a woman, based on the collaborative leadership style and emphasis on relationship building over hierarchical authority." Some analysts believe Chen might be a woman. Marcus was unknowingly speculating about his wife's gender while sitting next to her on a plane. "What do you think Chen will be like?" I asked. "Brilliant, obviously, probably intensely analytical, given the sophistication of their strategic frameworks. Dr. Chen describes Chen as someone who values authentic relationship building over transactional business arrangements. We arrived in Singapore on a humid Thursday morning and were transported to Chen Enterprises headquarters, a gleaming tower in the financial district that Marcus had researched extensively but never seen. As our car pulled up to the building, I watched his expression shift from nervous excitement to genuine awe. "This is incredible," he murmured, studying the architectural design I'd personally approved 3 years earlier. The building itself demonstrates the cultural integration philosophy, Western structural efficiency combined with Asian aesthetic principles. The lobby was designed to impress, with contemporary art from local artists and traditional cultural elements integrated seamlessly into the modern design. Marcus stood in the center of the space, slowly rotating to take in details I'd specified during the building's renovation. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, David Kim, appeared in the lobby, extending his hand in greeting. "Welcome to Singapore. Fold Chen is looking forward to meeting you both." I shook David's hand, noting the slight smile that suggested he was enjoying his role in the orchestrated revelation as much as I was. "Thank you for hosting us," Marcus replied. "Sarah and I are honored by the invitation." David led us to the executive elevator, the same private elevator I used daily when operating from Singapore headquarters. As we ascended to the 42nd floor, Marcus peppered David with questions about Chen Enterprises' operations and Chen's leadership philosophy. Chen believes that authentic partnership requires understanding individuals holistically, David explained. Professional capabilities are only one aspect of strategic compatibility. The elevator opened directly into the executive conference room where Richard Sterling and Patricia Mills were already seated, along with my sister Jennifer and 2 other senior advisors from Chen Enterprises' leadership team. "Welcome," Jennifer said, standing to greet us. Chen will join us momentarily. They prefer to observe initial interactions before engaging directly. Marcus took his seat at the conference table, his nervous energy evident as he organized his presentation materials. I sat beside him, playing the role of supportive spouse while internally preparing for the most significant revelation of our relationship. "Before Chen arrives," David announced, "they've requested that each couple share their perspective on authentic partnership, both in business and personal relationships." Richard and Patricia spoke first, discussing their collaborative approach to client development and their supportive marriage dynamics. Marcus and I were scheduled to present last, which would position us perfectly for the revelation I'd orchestrated. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Jennifer prompted when our turn arrived. Marcus stood up, pulling out his prepared notes. "Authentic partnership requires mutual respect, honest communication, and recognition of individual strengths," he began. "In business, this means acknowledging collaborative contributions and building on shared expertise. In marriage, it means supporting each other's growth while maintaining individual identity." I listened to Marcus describe partnership principles with genuine understanding, realizing that his transformation had extended beyond professional behavior to personal relationship philosophy. "Sarah," Jennifer addressed me directly, "what's your perspective on partnership dynamics?" I stood up slowly, knowing that my next words would begin the final phase of Operation Mirror. "I believe," I said carefully, "that authentic partnership requires seeing people as they truly are, rather than as we assume them to be. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from sources we least expect." Marcus nodded approvingly at what he interpreted as simple wisdom from his supportive wife. "Interesting perspective," David observed. Chen has expressed similar views about unexpected sources of strategic insight. At that moment, the conference room doors opened and my personal assistant entered, carrying a tablet and speaking in rapid Mandarin to David. The conversation was carefully choreographed. She was announcing Chen's arrival while discussing final presentation logistics. "Chen is ready to join the discussion," David announced. "However, they've requested individual meetings with each couple before the group's strategic session." Marcus's hands were visibly shaking as he gathered his materials. The moment he'd been preparing for throughout his entire transformation was finally arriving. "Mr. and Mrs. Morrison," Jennifer said, "Chen will see you first." We were escorted to an adjacent conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Singapore's skyline. The room was empty except for a single chair. "That sounds like good advice," I said, settling into the chair behind the desk. "I just hope Chen appreciates the transformation Sterling has undergone. The attribution practices, the collaborative frameworks, the cultural integration methodologies, All of it represents fundamental change in how we approach. Marcus stopped mid-sentence as he turned around and saw me seated behind Chen's desk. "Sarah," he said, confusion evident in his voice. "What are you doing behind the desk?" I smiled, pulling out my business cards and placing them on the desk where he could see them clearly. "Hello, Marcus. I'm Chen." The silence stretched for what felt like minutes as Marcus processed what I'd just said. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and slowly dawning comprehension. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Dr. Sarah Chen, founder and CEO of Chen Enterprises," I said formally. "Also known as Dr. Sarah Chen, your consultant for the past 6 months. Also known as Sarah Morrison, your wife of 3 years." Marcus sank into the chair across from the desk, his presentation materials scattered as they fell from his hands. "You've been, the whole time?" he stammered. "The whole time," I confirmed. "Every consultation with Dr. Chen, every insight about Southeast Asian markets, every piece of guidance about Chen Enterprises' partnership requirements, all of it came from your wife." Marcus stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. "But you don't understand business strategy. You ask naive questions. You said you were just learning." "I was teaching," I corrected gently. "The questions were designed to help you process information and develop your own analytical skills. The naive act was designed to keep you from recognizing that you were being educated by someone with more expertise than you realized." "How long have you known about my attribution practices?" Marcus asked quietly. "Since our second date," I replied honestly. "When you presented my ideas about micro-influencer marketing as your own insights, I realized you had a pattern of intellectual appropriation." Marcus buried his face in his hands. "And you married me anyway." "I married you because I saw your potential to become something better," I said. "The man who presented to Sterling's clients yesterday, the one who properly attributes collaborative insights and builds authentic strategic relationships, that's who I always hoped you could become." "By manipulating me for 3 years, by giving you the opportunity to choose between continued appropriation and authentic achievement," I corrected. "Every step of your transformation was voluntary. I provided guidance and opportunities, but you chose to implement ethical attribution practices and develop genuine expertise." Marcus looked up at me, his expression shifting from shock to something resembling understanding. The Singapore summit, the partnership requirements, the cultural transformation demands, all of it was designed to make me confront my behavior. "All of it was designed to help you become the ethical professional you've proven capable of being," I said. "Marcus, your work over the past 6 months has been genuinely impressive. The collaborative frameworks you've implemented, the cultural intelligence you've developed, the leadership transformation you've undergone, none of that was manipulated or artificial, but it was all guided by my wife pretending to be someone else. It was all guided by your wife helping you access expertise you needed to grow," I corrected. "The source of the guidance doesn't invalidate the growth you've achieved." Marcus sat in silence for several minutes, processing the revelation and its implications. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of humiliation and grudging admiration. "You've been playing chess while I thought we were playing checkers," he said. "I've been building a marriage while you were building a career on borrowed insights," I replied. "The question now is what we build together moving forward." "What happens next?" Marcus asked. "That depends on what you want to happen," I said. "Sterling and Associates has earned genuine partnership with Chen Enterprises based on the cultural transformation you led. Your attribution practices are now industry-leading, your collaborative leadership is authentic, and your expertise in Southeast Asian markets is legitimate. And our marriage," I leaned forward, speaking honestly for the first time in 3 years. "Our marriage becomes real. No more facades, no more stolen insights, no more underestimation. We become genuine partners, both personally and professionally." Marcus nodded slowly, beginning to understand the scope of what I'd created. "Sarah, Chen, whoever you are," he said with a slight smile, "you've been the most effective teacher I've ever encountered." "I've been your wife," I replied simply. Everything else was just methodology. As we prepared to rejoin the other summit attendees, Marcus turned to me with one final question. "Do you forgive me for the attribution theft?" "I forgive you for not recognizing my capabilities," I said. "The attribution theft was just a symptom of a deeper problem. Your assumption that intelligence couldn't exist in unexpected places." Marcus smiled, extending his hand in a gesture that felt like a new beginning. "Partners?" he asked. "Partners," I agreed, shaking the hand of the man who had finally become worthy of the success I'd helped him achieve. After all, the most satisfying revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. And Marcus had been transformed into exactly the kind of partner I'd always hoped to have, both in business and in life. The revelation was complete, but the real partnership was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.